Welcome to Iipc WAC Online Session 5. I'm Sawood from Wayback Machine at the Internet Archive, sharing this 30-minute session on preserving social media and video games. We have three panelists in this session. Kirk Mudle from New York University and the Museum of Modern Art. We're talking about their experience on game archiving. Then we have Magdalena Kodal and Stefan Jacobson from Arkivera, Sweden. Again, I sincerely apologize for pronouncing names incorrectly. Kirk is sharing the experience of comparing multiple virtual machine technologies for archiving and playing back video games. Arkivera team is describing their system and challenges of archiving social media. I would remind everyone you can use QA feature of Zoom to ask questions. And if there are questions that are already posted, instead of reposting them, just upvote them. This session is being recorded and might be published at some point in the future. So if you don't want your names associated with your question, please submit it anonymously. Now I would like to ask the two teams to briefly introduce their topics before we begin the Q&A session. Kirk, could you go first, please?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Sawood. So my presentation was based on a preservation implementation project that I did in partnership with the Museum of Modern Art's media conservation team. I tested the viability of 3 different virtual machine softwares capable of emulating Mac OS 9. That was SheepShaver, QEMU, and Yale University Libraries Emulation as a Service Infrastructure platform. I used the classic computer game Myst as a sample record and evaluated each virtual machine based on 4 metrics: speed, sound, graphics, and interactivity. While the tests overall showed that the emulators were mostly successful in replicating the game's original performance, there were quite a few issues getting sound to work properly with each emulator. And also, although Easy is an incredibly promising project, I found that due to its latency, that it just is not suitable at the moment for accessing or exhibiting video games or other computer and software-based artwork.
Thank you so much, Kirk. Now I would like to ask Magdalena if they can go and describe their project briefly.
Yeah, in our presentation, we told you about our journey developing Arkivera, the system for preserving information from social media, a system that we have been developing for the last 5 years or so. And when we started developing the system Arkivera, we had lots of experience of web archiving, but soon realized that the requirements that we met from our customers when they wanted to preserve information from social media platforms were a bit different. And we had to look at the problem from different aspects than we had done when web archiving, and especially in the means of technical and aspects, but also regarding different regulations. And we have discussed, and I mentioned some of the obstacles and issues that we have had to handle during the years. And some of them were the questions about metadata and how to store the information. In Sweden, we don't, or the National Archive doesn't recommend the walk format. So how to structure and how to save the information. And we also have about 300 archiving institutions in Sweden with different requirements and regulations that we have to answer to. And I finished my presentation by showing you the system Arkivera. And I also want to mention that since I made the recording, we have actually released a beta version of scheduling collection of information from, for example, Facebook and Instagram, YouTube, so that you can collect and preserve information on a monthly basis, for example. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So now I would invite everyone to post their questions in QA. And while people are posting the questions, I can start with some of the questions that I had ready. Kirk, if you could take this question, please. So I personally generally like the browser-based solutions because they are easy to disseminate, and you deploy it in one place, and a lot of people without any setup, they can just start experiencing it, right? So when I saw the Yale University solution, which you call EAAS, I think that kind of excited me more. But your findings were like it's slow. So I would like to know a little bit more, like what were the main causes of slowness? Was it like doing some live networking latency that it was experiencing, or there was like the browser was not utilizing the hardware of the machine, or they were like lack of simulation technology optimizations?
Sure, yeah, thank you for that question. I do believe, based on my tests, that it's based mostly on network latency. And just because easy is the way the acronym's pronounced, the way it works is, it's essentially streaming virtual machines across the internet through a web browser. So I believe that slowdown was caused by the network latency. Just transferring all of that information all at once is just naturally causes slowdown. And unfortunately, that slowdown is consistent with the environments as they perform. So the interactivity with the mouse movements and everything, and dragging and dropping things is there's just a lot of kind of sluggishness and slipperiness to that movement, even without games being played on there. So that's why my conclusions were, unfortunately, just at this moment, it's not, the technology isn't really there to properly access and exhibit a video games over streamed virtual machines. That was, yeah.
So I'm assuming they are not building a virtual machine in something like WebAssembly or something where everything runs in the browser itself. Rather, they are just running something on their server and doing some sort of VNC or some other client to share desktop in a browser or something, right?
Yes, that's correct. They're building their virtual machines mostly in QEMU, actually, and then uploading it into the web browser platform. I'm a little unfamiliar with the full technical details about how that backend works. And then some of the other nodes in EASY, which consist of about 16 other research universities in the United States and I believe some in Canada. They also upload things, well, they upload virtual machines using like SheepShaper as well. So I believe those are the main tools used to build the virtual machines, which are then put into the platform itself, rather than what the Internet Archive does.
Right. Thank you. Team Archivera, if you could answer this very quick question: is your system proprietary or open source?
Proprietary.
Okay. Any plans on sharing more details, if not code base?
And not at the moment, no, I would say, but we are happy to discuss the method and also how it's done within the system, but not share the code base, no.
Okay. So I have some more questions of my own, but I will take some questions from QA as though it started popping up. One coming from, one question is for Kirk, regarding archiving, preserving video games, and how far you take a specific hardware into account. Also, the hardware itself is very often really part of the experience.
Sure, thank you for that question. Well, I would agree that certainly the hardware itself is part of the original and authentic experience, and you would consider those some of the game's significant properties in the digital preservation context. But for the purposes of my project, I was more looking at ways that we could use virtual machine technology to access these games into the future, even if it's not, say, the optimal way to, or the most authentic way, say, because that would be, of course, playing it on the original legacy machines themselves. So that's definitely a concern. But I think that first and foremost is making sure the games are actually accessible and playable in some form, since these legacy hardwares will all eventually decay, and since they're not being supported by the original manufacturers, they won't be able to be accessed. The best way to access games like this is through emulation, in my personal opinion, and that's kind of just a unfortunate part of that there will be some loss of the experience without that original hardware. But yeah, being able to actually just access and play them is the most important part, I think.
I think it goes both ways, right? And sometimes modern hardware will be more capable, and even emulation inside can benefit from the outside hardware, right? So for example, if you were to access like internet using like an old browser that is emulated in another web browser, the system might be using your own fast network now than the 20 years ago when people were using dial-up connections and stuff like that, right? So it was like how far that goes in one way or the other. I think people can emulate slow network, right? So there is a question for our QA team. What have you found to be the main ethical challenges with archiving social media?
I would say there are several, but what you collect and how you do it is, of course, the main question. And in our system, it's always the one having a Facebook page or having an account that initiates the preservation, and it's their data, it's not our data. So it's kept, they have it and they can always, yeah, we don't have access to it. But some, of course, there's always a question about what to preserve when people see it as more of their personal information, or they haven't really thought that this information can be saved forever or accessed. But many of our users of the system today are public agencies, and they have, yeah, within the Swedish regulations and in many other countries, it's seen as public records. And that must often be, or it must be communicated in some way when you communicate with the public agency, for example, that this can be a public record and can be saved forever and accessed for a lot of people in the future as well. But I would say that's one of the ethical aspects that we have discussed a lot and always discuss with our customers and users of the system. How is the information, which information is harvested and preserved, and how is the preserved information then being used and published, for example. But yeah, you always have to think about the ethical aspects as well as the preservation aspect, and the importance of preserving this part of our history.
Reminds me of one of the things you said in your presentation. Like, I mean, there are difficult balance to make there, right? I mean, there is one thing is preservation, the other side, like preserving privacy and whatnot. And it sure is a difficult challenge, and sometimes you preserved it and you identified after the fact, and then altering records going back is another problem. So I'll take this follow-up question for Kirk. Can you compare your approach maybe with porting? If I understood it correctly, I guess we're talking about they're transforming the game itself to new machines, kind of, is that what it means? If so, I think you can address it better.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so by porting, I didn't mention this in my brief summary, but that was essentially building virtual machine packages that could then be ported or transferred as self-contained virtual machines. So self-contained in the sense that they're a single file or as close to a single file package as possible, and that they don't need any extra installation on the new host machine. So what I did with that was, that's a feature actively supported by Sheepshaver. So I built, and it follows a similar structure to how you would set up a normal Sheepshaver emulator, just with a few key differences. So what I did there was I built the virtual machine, I installed the operating system, I made the package itself, and then installed Mist onto it, which made the essentially so that the virtual machine operates as though there's a Mist CD plugged in or inserted into the virtual machine itself, so that Mist appears immediately on the desktop and is capable of being played right away. So then I took that package, I uploaded it to the Internet Archive, and I downloaded it on 2 different new host machines. One was a MacBook from 2015, and another was a computer in MoMA's Media Conservation Lab. That was a Mac Pro from 2019. And I tested the virtual machine basically on both of those platforms and found that they operate identically to how they operate on my original host machine. The only difference was that there was the settings for some reason cannot be configured in the 2019 Mac Pro, whereas they could be reconfigured in the 2015 MacBook. I'm still figuring out exactly why that was the case, but yeah. So that was kind of my main way of doing what I was calling porting. Hopefully that clarifies something.
So 2 quick questions from and very related in a sense. One is when you launch these virtual machines, do they directly launch the application itself, or you launch into an operating system and then user has to kind of start the game manually inside the VM?
The user would have to manually start the game inside. Yeah. But I did have it so it's pre-installed, so they don't have to go through the original installation process. And then on that new host machine, if the user just saving their game, they can then save the new versions of the game to that virtual machine environments and are able to access it and replay it. So essentially, that's why I'm calling them portable in that way, that they're this single file you can take and then port to other machines.
So I mean, yeah, the machine is kind of the VM is in a sense mutable as they play games and the state changes, right?
Yes.
One thing I realized, I think in your when you loaded stuff to Internet Archive and downloaded and played back on other machines, I think you remained in the Mac world and didn't check it on Windows or Linux machines. Is that correct?
That is correct. Unfortunately, SheepShaver is an application that only works in Mac environments. So that is a limitation. That's kind of one of the main limitations, just because emulating Mac OS 9 in particular, various versions of it, is just a very difficult process. So most of the emulators that exist only run on Apple systems already. QEMU is an exception, so that one could work in Windows environments as well. But I haven't gotten to get a portable version of QEMU to work in the same way that SheepShaver does. With SheepShaver, it's a much simpler process.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So this question, actually, there are a couple of questions in the same, is for Team Alcvera, and the second question resonates with one of my own questions as well. So it says, could you tell me what file formats you use in saving the social media into your system, and how do you guarantee the integrity and authenticity of those files? Also, how do you cope with the changes made by social media organizations, like when changes happen in the upstream?
The file format question, we store the information today as HTML files with the attached images and videos and so on from the different social media platforms that we get. We use apps on the different social media platforms that we have gotten granted permissions to have this kind of service and this kind of system for archiving purposes for our customers. So the information is stored as HTML files with the attached files, and we always make sure to preserve the information in the format that it was when the archiving process was initiated. So the changes of the platforms have been one of the biggest obstacles, and is today as well, I would say, when building this kind of system. And we always, as I said, preserve how it looked when archiving the information. Then if you do a new archiving and new archiving process and save the information again, it will be preserved and stored as it looked the structure and the information we get from the social media platform at that moment, and then we create a new version of the information so that you can go back and forth and see how did the information, how was the information structured when being archived. But of course, we have to make sure to not, we structure the posts and the comments in a similar way as the social platforms without interfering with their copyright on how their platforms look. So this is also always a balance. And we are, for example, by Meta reviewed annually as everyone using their APIs, where they look at, do these reviews of how we store and extract information from the platforms.
So I think the authenticity part, I think, is also still an open question, and not necessarily for this application, but in the web archiving world in general.
Yeah.
Whether or not the information was changed before serving it or at the time of archiving, it all boils down to trusting on the organization who is archiving. Not necessarily, there is not necessarily a technical solution at work at a scale at this point that can be leveraged to prove that the content was indeed not changed or something, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And we always want the user to make sure that they have retrieved all the information and that you also make some sort of check that you have gotten the information that you wanted to archive. And we have used the term archival copy to be very clear that this is a copy of the information. You can preserve the text and you can preserve the images, but it's still a copy. So yeah, this is a problem, but I would say it's the same problem that you have when doing web archiving generally.
So I have a question of my own. In the introduction, you mentioned that the Swedish organizations or some entities are not necessarily encouraging use of WARC files. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. The national.
If so, what are the rationale behind that?
I'm not really sure, but as the National Archive in Sweden says clearly no to WARC format, most other regional archival institutions in Sweden also say no to the WARC format. We work with it for some organizations, but there are very few in Sweden. And I think one of the issues with it is that it's so specific for web archiving, and if you're not, we are a small country with limited resources, and if the knowledge is too small about the WARC format, then many organizations, including the National Archive, has been quite restrictive with it. So here the recommendations are generally to preserve both websites and information from, for example, social media as HTML files with, so you get quite flat structure compared with the WARC format, for example.
This is kind of surprising to me in a sense, and I think this will be helpful that you brought this up at Iipc. You can think about it like, I mean, if there is like a gap in education or kind of awareness of the flexibility or the value WARC files bring to the table, then perhaps that can be communicated with in better ways. Or if there are shortcomings in the format itself that some people are not finding it adequate enough in non-web context, and so those could be addressed as well. Thanks for surfacing that this problem up here, and perhaps we can chat more about it. There is another question on QA. is it accurate that the social media captures require the admin access to the account itself? Only the owner of said account can do the capture?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And that's also been part of the ethical aspects of capturing the information, and also in the process of getting the approvals of this kind of apps and system from the different social media platforms. So yes, that's correct.
All right, so maybe there is another question for Kirk here from my side. So, so your research evaluates various options and identifies a couple of suitable candidates, say when there's enough research done on this. From there, what would be the next step, right? I mean, if archiving organizations want to archive games, what will be involved as in human resource, compute resources, and any steps to go from there? Okay, we chose to go with Kimu. Now what? One game at a time, and how many steps will be involved in archiving that?
Sure, thank you. Well, I would definitely say one game at a time is not necessarily the best approach when using virtual machines. I think a better solution for like any memory institution that wants to do this would be to build the virtual machine environments themselves that are capable of, that are compatible with games. So just building a working Mac OS 9 environment that would then give you access presumably to hundreds or maybe even thousands of different games, as long as you have disk images for those games that can be then uploaded to the virtual machine, which would be a simple process even on a portable virtual machine like a sheep shaver unit that's been ported to a new computer. You could easily import a new disk image into that machine. So you can make that basically just a whole environment, just like you would have, a normal computer in a computer lab. So I think that would be really the best way to, kind of leverage this technology. For maybe an art museum, it would, the one game at a time approach might make more sense. Like that's the reason I did this with MoMA, since they are very concerned as art museum about getting the most authentic experience possible. That was the reason for using a control experiment, running the game on the original Power Mac hardware, and then comparing the virtual machine just to make sure that authenticity was as close as it could be. But yeah, otherwise, I would say, if you can, you would need, your digital preservation team to kind of begin to learn these types of software, get a handle on them, which is of course a big ask given time and resource constraints. But I really think that anyone that's interested in preserving software of any kind should start to try to teach themselves some virtual machine capabilities and some virtual machine softwares. And one other point that I wanted to say was, I lost it actually. Never mind.
All right. So what I get from your description and kind of some of my own thoughts, kind of what I'm seeing proposed here is there is a list of virtual machines that are being archived, and here is a list of games archived. Then some sort of association between them, like this game can play back in so-and-so VM, and this VM can play back so-and-so games. So if someone goes to the game page, it automatically suggests or proposes like these are the VMs that you can clip it with and play in there. Or if someone opens up a VM, it automatically kind of polls the list of games that are playable there, and people can select and get one piece at a time and basically play it back. Do you think that would be a practical approach to go about it?
Yes, that does sound very practical. I know there are ways to do that. I believe Easy actually has a built-in feature that when you upload you can upload your own software files to Easy, and then they compare them with compatible operating systems. Well, operating systems that may be compatible at least. I don't think the matching is perfect in 100% of cases, but it is it is getting there. It's quite advanced. Yes.
Thank you so much. I think we are about the time for this session. A big round of applause for our panelists. It was an interesting session indeed.